Hello again. This is Dr. Robert Guthrie, and we're back for what will be our final lesson, completing our church history symposium. As you know, we started these and uploaded them when the pandemic hit, and they canceled the in-person services. It's been about 2.5 years. We covered the New Testament, we covered the Old Testament, and people wanted to go on with the church history. And this is the last lesson of the church history. So we will stop after this with the YouTube ones, and we'll go back to inpatient worship in early September. So if you're in the Dublin, Ohio area and you want to come back and have the in-person classes, it starts in September 11th at Jerome United Methodist. So this is our last lesson. I would give thanks to my technical team, my daughter Brianna, who's taping me now, and her husband Eric, who tapes a lot. And Eric does yeoman service uploading these onto the YouTube, which takes a lot of time and effort. So it's been I really appreciate their effort over these 2.5 years, and we've enjoyed it. It's been good for me, good for them. We'll have a good, sober Methodist celebration before we finally wrap all this up. But that's where we are. So the last one is the last lesson, Methodism in America. And you have to understand the uniqueness of the American political system after the Constitution and the Bill of Rights created a wild free market in religion opportunities, that the churches had to compete to have membership and attract new people, because there wasn't a state church. When you had state churches in most of the countries that sent people to the U.S. In England, and it was the England, Scotland, it was the Presbyterians. In Germany, it was the Lutherans. Scandinavia, it was the Reformed Church in Holland, et cetera, et cetera. So you had established churches, and that can be kind of stifling to inventiveness, that you're comfortable and you're supported by tax dollars, and everybody's a member, and you don't really have to reach out. Here, you didn't have that. You didn't have any official church. They had them in the colonial, and some of the colonies had official churches prior to the Revolution, but once the Constitution and Bill of Rights went through, those went poof. But it produced this free market. So the churches need to learn to adapt, to be enthusiastic, to be energetic if they're going to recruit new members. And therefore, you had a much more active historical impact of Christianity in the U.S. and later Judaism too, because of the freedom of religion and no state-sponsored church. So it was an enormous blessing. And along comes the Methodists, perfectly adapted to this new environment. The Methodist movement had three advantages in this environment. One is it had an open theology, Arminianism, which means that everyone is a candidate for salvation, that it's up to us to get the message to them, it's up to them to accept it, but it's open to everybody. Come one, come all. That differs from the Calvinistic approach of predestination. I'm a forward predestination Calvinist, and I've come to reject that completely. It's a little obvious. Because if it's all been decided in advance, why are we bothering, But here, we can bring salvation to all these people who are unchurched. So that's the first thing. The second one, where there was a long history of, from John Wesley, who had picked it up from George Whitefield, to preach in the open air, to go to where the masses are, not to necessarily be in the big fancy churches, but go and reach out to the population. So they had open air preaching, which he did, and it adapted itself here to the U.S. In what became known as the camp meetings. The camp meetings were, excuse me here, my allergies are getting the better of me here, were large gatherings that would run several days. They'd be out in part of the country where there weren't houses around. People would come and camp and picnic. There'd be a series of preachers who would be up on the stand, and they'd preach these sermons, often charismatic type sermons. And there'd probably be bands there playing instruments and singing and song and picnicking and socialization, etc. We have a milder version of that recently, where they had the gospel, Christian music festivals that we went to a number of years ago when we were much younger. But this is very successful, and it would bring the church to the people, because often these people were too isolated from established churches. It would reach out to them. But the third thing, which was very much an imitation of Wesley, was creating the circuit rider system, which was the Methodists were way ahead of everybody else on this. Wesley had ridden all over England and Scotland and Ireland and Wales. Most people think he rode about 250,000 miles on his horse, probably multiple horses. That's 10 times around the earth at the equator. But it was established a custom of reaching out, the pastor reaching out to where the people are to bring the faith to them. And they adapted it here in the U.S., and it was very, very successful. The church started a little bit without proper planning because Wesley hadn't really separated his church from the Anglican church by the time the Revolution hit, the American Revolution hit. That there had been a number of people who came over who had joined the Methodist societies in Britain back prior to the Revolution and immigrated to the United States. And so Wesley hears about this. In about 1769, he sends a couple missionaries over to try to foster these societies teaching Methodism. Those people have kind of disappeared into history. But 2 years later, in 1771, he sent over two more people. And these people were Richard Wright and Francis Asbury. They were very successful and they're well known in history. Francis Asbury is one of the two founders of the American Methodist movement. And the movement was starting slowly prior to the Revolution because a lot of the colonies actually had state churches, and you had to compete with that establishment thing. The Revolution comes, most of the missionaries go back to England. Asbury stays, and he sits out the Revolution. Wesley supported him sitting it out because he wasn't a fighter, he wasn't a politician, he was a pastor. So he sits it out, and then lo and behold, the Americans win. So the American independence is accepted in September of 1783. Took a long time, but the communication was so slow. You'd sail 6 weeks across the Atlantic to bring the messages there. So, and then Wesley realizes he can't have a subordinate Methodist movement in the U.S. that's subordinate to the Church of England, to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Because the actual head of the Church of England was then and is still the monarch. Queen Elizabeth now, but prior monarchs. It just wouldn't work. So have to establish an American church, American United Methodist Church. So he sends over another person, Thomas Coke. And with Coke, he sends along the organizational documents, like the 39 Articles of Faith, similar to the Anglican ones. He sends along what became the Book of Discipline, how you structure, how you do, and other texts on structuring the church, putting it together. So Coke brings these over. They have a meeting in Baltimore in December of 1784, by the time everybody gets together, and they create the Methodist Episcopal Church in the U.S. That was the original name. And it's kind of the Christmas meeting. It's at Lovely Lane Chapel, which is outside Baltimore then. It's now moved down inside the city, and it's Lovely Lane United Methodist Church. I've been there. They have a small museum, and they have Asbury's saddle, which he rode on all over the circuits, all over the country, taking the message out. And I thought, wow, that's really neat that they were able to preserve his saddle all these centuries later. To reach back into the history. So it's one of those historical things that I've seen. It actually kind of touched me to be able to see that. Asbury and was the pivotal leader. He was kind of the emotional, charismatic leader. Coke was more the administrative person. These are often different skill sets between being creative and charismatic type leader and an administrative person. And they would trade. They created an office of general superintendent, which oversaw the whole church. Similar to a bishop, they didn't call it that in those days, and they would kind of trade this off each year, a couple years. So both of them were founders of the American Methodist movement. This is when they developed the circuit rider concept, which really made them extremely successful in this part of the country, because this was the frontier after the American Revolution. Ohio didn't become a state until 1803. The last major Indian fight was at Fallen Timbers, which I think was like 1796, not that long before statehood. And so this was really small communities of scattered farmers. So it worked extremely well here. The circuit riders would ride about a 2-week circuit, and they would ride the same circuit over and over again. People would get to know them. And these were people who were not ivory tower intellectuals. They were farmers and other people who had adapted to this, and they brought three things with them. And they would stay probably in the house. The member of the congregation of the largest house would often create a room for the circuit rider to come and live in for the day. And they would bring three things. They'd have a church service. They would bring religious education. They would have sermons that they would preach based on the scriptures, etc. They would have Sunday schools, crucial Sunday schools for the children to really help them learn to read, to perfect their reading skills. Because you can't read the Bible if you can't read. And a really good Christian has to study the scriptures, as we've done here for years, to understand what the faith really means. And they would have adult Sunday school also. So they brought those two things. And the third thing he brought was sanctification, which is an interesting concept. It wasn't that you have to live this straight and narrow life, that you can't have alcohol, you can't do this, you can't do that, can't do that. That makes you a Christian. That's the reverse. That if you're really a dedicated Christian, you want to demonstrate your Christianity and your love of your fellow man by living a loving, generous Christian life. So sanctification led to, at that time, the social gospel. Social gospel was very successful, put the Methodists at the forefront because they realized we need to go out and serve our fellow man. So they would go to the county jails and the prisons to make certain the prisoners were well cared for, that they had decent diet, they had adequate clothes, and they had access to what little health care there was in those days. They ran orphanages. They had one here in the Worthington area called the Methodist Children's Home. I was actually on the board there for a few years. It's closed up because they don't need orphanages anymore. And they had a wide variety of other movements like that to care for people. Aid societies, help people, and they worked in the poorhouse that the counties would maintain for the poor people. They'd help people there, work in the hospitals, even led to creation of hospitals, the large Methodist hospital system here in Columbus. So they brought these three things to them. They also brought a bishop system, a hierarchical system in which the church was organized nationally through regional conferences, or in the West Ohio Conference, here there's an East Ohio Conference. And this was in the end, a very good thing, but it rankled certain people. So certain groups would say, we think a bishop system isn't American, and we want to leave the church for that. Well, what's the structure got to do with Americanism? Because the church is the church universal, not the church American. But this led to certain groups breaking away. The first one was something called the Methodist Protestant Church, which really rejected the bishop concept, and it broke away in 1828. And stayed independent, and eventually came back in 1939, over 100 years later. There was a great merger of three Methodist churches coming together, and they came back in the Methodist Protestant Church. There was the Wesleyan Methodist Church separated in 1848. This was a church that was very anti-slavery, but the Methodist Church had already split over slavery. They were pacifistic. They didn't want violence. And they did not want a bishopric system. They have stayed independent. They are based here in the Midwest, in the Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky area. And they merged with the Pilgrim Holiness Church in 1968. But there were several other churches that broke away from the Wesleyan Church and formed these other small churches. So these churches that break away in schisms really don't maintain a strong enough national or organizational structure, and they're vulnerable to having all other kind of schisms. Many of these schisms, in my opinion, are based on the ego trips of various people in charge. I watched one from my old Southern Presbyterian Church in the early 1970s, where it separated what's now become the Presbyterian Church of America. They had several lasting effects. One is there were about 5 or 6 strong pastors at the peak of their career, and they didn't want the church having women in positions of authority, so they led this revolt, and the church told, no, we're not changing this policy, and they said, we're going to walk out, and they did. But the problem is 5 years later, those people have died or retired because they were at the peak of their time, and they were doing it as much for their own egos as anything else, violating the 11th and the 12th commandments. 11th commandment, of course, is thou shalt not take thyself too seriously. The 12th commandment is thou shalt not believe thine own BS. And a lot of these people who sit these schisms think they're more important. Their emotional needs, their psychological needs are more important than the message. And I just think that's wrong. And so that church has had 5 other schisms break away from it in the 50 years since it's been in existence. So you got to be really careful about this. Having an organizational structure can be weak, but it can also bring some stability and keep these things from just fracturing apart. So anyway, they did preserve the bishop system. The big split came in 1844. In 1844, the Methodist Church, along with other churches subsequently, split up over slavery. Now, it's an interesting question because slavery, of course, is not forbidden in the New Testament. However, it does violate the loving your fellow man, to love your neighbor as yourself. And so there was a Methodist bishop in Georgia who had inherited a slave. He hadn't bought the slave; he had inherited him. There was at the general conference, the squabble was, can a Methodist bishop own a slave? And it was decided that no, he couldn't. And this aroused the defenders of slavery, and they can go back and quote Old Testament and stuff like that about values of slavery, etc. And the church split. All the churches split. The Presbyterian split. I was in the old Southern Church, and the split often went on for a long time. There was a subsequent split also of what became the Free Methodist Church, split off in 1858. That's a small conservative rural church which had other splits again in the 1920s and 1930s. Like these small churches, they fracture around people's egos all the time. It's really not healthy. So the big split over North and South, split over slavery. The Methodist Church South was called the Methodist Episcopal Church South, and it went on until 1939. In parallel to this whole thing were the emergence of 3 African American churches, which are distinct and remain independent at this point. And there's about 6 million members, and put those 3 African American churches together. It's an interesting point that my closest African American friend says, what's the most segregated time in America? Sunday morning. And maybe that's advantageous, maybe not. It's an interesting question. I don't know a lot of these answers. I know the questions, but not the answers. And these started in 3 different places. The first one started in the Baltimore and Philadelphia area because there were free African Americans who had been freed, and they were Methodists. They wanted to go to the Methodist Church, and they were right about 1800 time, they were told they weren't welcome, which is a terrible sin on the part of the churches to do that, to say that. You want to welcome everyone. Everyone's God's children, but they did. And so they formed the American Methodist Episcopal Church, AME, and it started in the early 1800s in the Baltimore, Philadelphia area. A separate church began in the New York area called the Zion Congregation, and they approached the AME. AME Church was founded in about 1806 or so. The AME Zion Church wanted to be part of that, but they got in a squabble with the AME leadership over something, I don't know, probably egos more than anything. And they set up their own church called the AME Zion Church, African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, which still exists also. It came out of the New York area in 1812. And after the Civil War, a 3rd African American church was started. And this was the Methodist Church South, was a segregated church, and it wasn't going to let the freed slaves in. So it created a shadow church, called the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, or CME. It was Southern-based, and after the Civil Rights Movement got going, it changed its name to the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. They could continue the CME. Those 3 churches still exist. They're independent of one another. They cooperate on certain things like higher education and seminaries and all that, and I think the printing facility is shared. but they remain independent. But they have about 6 million members. This is a fairly substantial part of the Methodist movement, are these 3 African American churches. The other arm, which is now part of our church, the United Methodist Church, came from 2 Germanic-based groups in the U.S. who adopted Wesleyan theology of Arminianism. The first is the Evangelical Association, and this was formed in Pennsylvania in, let me check my notes here, I think about 1801 or something, I can't remember, early 1800s, Evangelical Association. They were predominantly German language based, excuse me. And there was another group called the United Brethren, which was also a Germanic based. So they were conducting services in German. They would speak in German there. They would have German hymns, etc. And they remained 2 independent churches. They were not bishop churches. They were relatively small. But they started to collapse in the 1940s because German wasn't real popular when we're fighting the Nazis around the world. And the rapid communication of radio, television hadn't come in yet, and the rapid public education meant running the services in German was a death thing. People weren't going to do it. The young just wouldn't continue learning German just to go to this German-speaking church. They'd go to an English-speaking church. So they were really struggling, and they merged in 1946, right after World War II, become the Evangelical United Brethren. It was a fairly noticeable church here in the Ohio and Pennsylvania area. A lot of German immigrants, my great-grandparents moved here, came in from Germany after the various revolutions of the 1800s and settled. So you had a large German group here. And they merged in 1946 after the war, trying to preserve their system. But they were a different, they said they were Wesleyan in theology, they probably were, but they were not a bishop-oriented system. It's the community, individual church system. And they were continuing to struggle and flounder along. So the Great Methodist merger was in 1939, and the 3 churches came together. The Methodist Episcopal Church, which is the Northern Church, Methodist Episcopal Church South, the Southern Church, and the Methodist Protestant Church, which had broken away in the 1820s, come together in the Great Merger. And they create the Methodist Episcopal Church, period. It was really the Great Depression that drove them together. That when nobody had any money, the churches suffered because people didn't have money to give them, and they to have 3 sets of administrative expenses over these 3 denominations made no sense. So you bring them together, you have 1 set of administrative offices, 1 publishing house, 1 this, 1 that, and that made excellent sense, brought together by the Great Depression. It's very interesting how you have other effects, other things affecting the church development. The rapid communication of radio and public education finished off the German-speaking churches. Great Depression pushed all the Methodist churches together. And then finally in 1969 was the final merger, 1968, excuse me, where 10 million Methodists merged with 800,000 people from the Evangelical United Brethren, who was probably dying at the time the church was. So it was more of an assumption of a takeover than it was a true merger. They changed the name to the United Methodist Church. You combine the 2 names when you do this, and that's the church that we have today. We preserve the bishop system that we have, like it or not. That's what we've got. I like it. With all its problems, it's better than a community-based system that I grew up with in the Presbyterian Church. So that's where we are. This is and we do find an interesting presence here. The EUB was a very strong presence here in Ohio. They had a seminary, the Union Seminary, which is over Dayton area. They had Otterbein College, which is now Methodist College, but which was one of their main colleges. And a number of people that I knew when I became a Methodist had come out of the EUB side of the church. It was a little more conservative culturally but those things fade away with time after the 1968 merger. So that's where we stand at this point. Will things change? Sure, things always change. But we must remember the Christian message is very simple. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. Love the Lord Jesus Christ as your Savior, as God coming to earth as your Savior, and love your neighbor as yourself. And that's the hardest one, because you got it's easy to love people that you really love, to get along with, family members and all that. These are people you don't like, people that are difficult, people that are dangerous. You have to love them like yourself also. So it's a very simple message. And I'll stop here. That's my one little sermonette in the whole time. The message is very simple. Let's continue to love our neighbors as ourselves. This is our final lesson. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be able to do this for you. And I'll be back in church on September 11th at 10 o'clock. If you want to come to the Jerome United Methodist Church in September, this is Dr. Guthrie for Brianna and Eric. We're thanking you all very much.